So, you're in an airplane, either still on the ground or somewhere in the air or nearing your final destination, and the pilot comes on the speaker and says these two dreaded words: "Well, folks." And you know what that pilot's going to say next. "We've been rerouted." And then they go on to explain that the weather or some mechanical issue or a medical emergency has preempted the flight plan, which now means that your travel plans have also been preempted and rerouted. Or you're driving along the interstate and suddenly traffic slows down and begins backing up, and you see up ahead that the police are directing the traffic off of the highway and onto the next exit ramp that leads to who knows where. And you know then that you've been rerouted. Or worse yet, and I'm sure none that has this ever happened to you, you rely on your GPS to take you someplace. But every time you make a turn, you hear that voice, "You're being rerouted." That happened to us not too long ago when we found ourselves being rerouted through a Kmart parking lot. And yes, every traveler encounters such rerouting sooner, if not later, even when it's simply trying to get from one side of Bloomington to the other, when all the east-west major corridors are under construction. And sooner or later, every life encounters unanticipated reroutings. Despite all your good intentions, despite all the ways you have truly tried, as our psalmist today puts it, try to follow God's true path, you find yourself on roads you never meant to take and you never meant to be on. Today's psalm, with its travel metaphors that lift up the challenges that come with life's journey, reminds us that, regardless of who's at fault, sometimes we do get off the beaten path. Sometimes we do get off track. Sometimes we do find ourselves on detours that are not planned, not welcomed, not expected. There are always the small detours of life, like having to get off the interstate and search for the nearest Target when deep into your road trip to the beach, your preteen, who will go unnamed, says, "You know, Mom, when you told me to pack my swimsuit and underwear, I forgot." And then there are those more aggravating detours that happen when you aren't paying attention and when you suddenly notice that the interstate you thought you were on now had another number and you're about 700 miles away from where you should have been. Again, I'm going to protect the names of the innocent. The detours that the psalmist alludes to are those that go way beyond the merely aggravating and take us, as the psalmist says, to the brink of disaster, needing strength to go on, with roadblocks and bullies everywhere we face. Perhaps you've been on one of those detours. Perhaps you are on one of those detours. There are vocational detours. You've been fired or demoted, forced to retire, or you lose your business and you find yourself without a vocational identity or the financial security you had mapped out for yourself. There are relationship detours when, for whatever reason, things take a wrong turn and keep going down wrong pathways, and you find yourself in the wreckage of a relationship you thought would never be possible. Then there are the detours and multiple reroutings that happen within the complexities of family life. difficult parent-child relationships, financial problems, illnesses and addictions, or any number of other circumstances that throw you into previously unmapped territory where the terrain is rough and the way forward isn't clear. There are also what we call spiritual detours, where we wrestle for years with our inner selves, trying to conquer old patterns and addictions, bad habits and demons in order to grow stronger and freer, and somehow we never quite seem to get there. Perhaps most devastating are the detours that come from our own moral failures and failings. When we find ourselves saying things and doing things and being part of things that we never thought we would do or say or participate in, either as individuals or as a nation, and now we find ourselves on a highway built on lies and deceit that we can't seem to get off of, and we wonder, how did we ever get to this point? So what do we do when we find ourselves rerouted and regardless of who is at fault, heading somewhere we never expected to find ourselves and in a place we don't want to be? Well, as people of faith, the first thing we can do is simply remember that we stand in good company. You see, almost half of the 150 Psalms that we have in our Bible, including the one that we read today, are written by poets who lament that they are on some sort of rerouted journey. Written over the course of perhaps 500 years, the authors of these Psalms do not shy away from honestly expressing how lost they are in a particular moment, or how their life's journey had taken them on detours they didn't want or didn't bargain for. And this leads us to a second thing we can do when we find ourselves rerouted. We can honestly acknowledge our lostness. Honestly acknowledge that we are in a place that is far from where we wanted to be, and humbly confess that we need help to get back on track. There is nothing, my friends, wrong with admitting that you are in over your head, and without wasting time and energy trying to place blame or shame on yourself or someone else or something else, there's nothing wrong with naming the fact that you are in a situation that you don't know how to get out of. There's nothing wrong with simply saying, help. Years ago, when my youngest son Jonathan was about 4, we were at one of those all-you-can-eat buffets. Now, Sam, who was about 8 years old at the time, discovered a self-serve soft ice cream machine in the back corner of the restaurant, and he came back to the table with a bowl of ice cream that swirled so perfectly that we oohed and awed and all commented that he should go apply for a job at Dairy Queen. And actually he did. He didn't get that job that time. As we all continued to enjoy our meals, going back and forth from the buffet line to the table, sampling all sorts of goodies, all of a sudden, we hear Jonathan's voice yelling out, "Sam, help!" Sam jumped out of his chair and he ran toward the sound of his brother's voice, and a minute or two later, here they come, Jonathan holding this dish of ice cream that is so high and so overfilled that it's spilling all over his arms and his hands. You see, he had tried to fill his own ice cream dish, but he didn't know how to turn off the spigot. Thus, Sam, help. No matter where you are on life's journey, your own life's journey, whether you are 4 or 14 or 44, 64 or 94, in those situations when you find yourself off course, one of the best things you can do is name out loud the fact that you are in over your head, acknowledge the fact that you need help, and then ask for it. Which brings us to the third thing we can do when we find ourselves rerouted. We can know who to call on for help. Jonathan, of course, knew to call on Sam because he had seen that Sam knew how to stop that flow of ice cream. Plus, he already had 4 years of experiencing his older brother's protective eye watching out for him. The psalmist, too, knows who to call on in those times when life's plans are rerouted not by ice cream machines, but by machines of war and slavery and poverty, machines of institutionalized oppression under cruel dictatorships, plans rerouted by those things that bulldoze and bully their way into life. Those things that, in the psalmist's words, don't care a thing about God. Nor do they know about God. But the psalmist knows about God. The psalmist knows by faith and from experience and through stories passed down from trusted generation to trusted generation. The psalmist knows about how God has always been great toward God's people, as it says, how God has been there to snatch them from the brink of disaster and gently but powerfully over and over and over put them back on their feet and point them in the right directions. The psalmist knows to call on God, to cry for help in those times of being lost, no matter who or what is to blame, whether the psalmist's own short-sightedness or the bullying of an oppressive power or a combination of both. Because you see, the psalmist knows and trusts that God is, and read this in your insert, God is both tender and kind, not easily angered, immense in love, and never quits. Oh, you, O God, the psalmist prays, you are tender and kind, not easily angered, immense in love, and you never quit. We worship quite a God, don't we? Our English language doesn't have a single word that fully describes this God and this God's love. In the Hebrew language, there was a word that better characterizes who God is at God's core, and that Hebrew word is chesed. Chesed. Try to say it from the back of your throat. Chesed. Go ahead, try it, but don't aim at your neighbor's neck. Chesed. It's been translated in multiple ways, this word has said, over in various English translations as steadfast love, as loving kindness, as mercy, as loyalty, favor, devotion, goodness. We sang about God's chesed in our psalm response. O Lord, O God, unwearied is your love for us. And the translation we have today is one that also I like about explaining chesed. God's is immense in love and never quits. Another way of talking about God's chesed is this. God's unconditional grace is present all the time. God's grace is present all the time. When you are detoured, and you will be, when you are rerouted, and you will be, what do you do? I was taught to look for a landmark, for something familiar that I can put me back in the right direction, that I can help use to reorient me, even if the route is new. And as people of faith, that landmark for us is God's chesed, God's immense love, God's unconditional grace for you and for me that never, never quits. It's a signpost we should look for when we are seeking a way forward. It's a star by which we should navigate. It's a rest stop along the way that gives us respite. It's the arrow that points the way out when we find ourselves going in circles. Look for signs of grace, friends. They are there. Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, with that calming minister voice of his, channeled something that his own mother told him in those times when he felt lost or afraid. She said, "Look for the helpers." Yes, helpers can be signs of God's grace. Archbishop Desmond Tutu advises those who are detoured by discouragement that they can look for someone to help. Yes, taking opportunities to help someone, to be a helper to someone, can be open yourself up to signs of God's grace. A friend of ours who struggles on the road called despair tells us that she looks for red birds when she needs a reminder of God's grace. Another friend looks for rainbows as a reminder of God's grace, while another, a cancer survivor, looks for pink ribbons as signs of God's grace. A colleague tells me she looks for moments of grace as she writes in her daily gratitude journal. And many, many of you have told me that this room, with the table and the cross and the window, is where you look when you need to be reminded of God's amazing grace. Wherever you are on your journey, whether you know it or not, God's grace is present. So you may as well look for it. In your darkest hour, when you're so lost in back alleys filled with potholes and you don't think you'll ever find your way out, it's there. When the road is smooth and you don't think you need it, it's there. And when you know you need it, yes, it's there. Wait for it. As long as it takes, it is there. Author Frederick Buechner tells about a time in his life when he was on a very dark road in the throes of despair, not seeing any signs of God's grace. He was driving through a thick fog one evening, almost ready to give up, when he pulled to the side of the road, only to discover that another car had also pulled over to wait out the fog and was right there in front of him. All Frederick could see through that fog was the car's bumper and license plate. Only on the license plate, there weren't the regular numbers, just 5 letters. G-R-A-C-E. That license plate, of all things, was exactly what he needed in that moment. Indeed, grace is there. Grace is here, for grace is who God is. And as the psalmist proclaims, this God never quits on us. And that, dear friends, is about the best news I can ever know. Good news indeed. Amen.